I'm an art historian and curator and currently the associate professor of art history at NYU Abu Dhabi, where I teach modern art of the Arab world and global conceptual art. My approach to teaching art from this region is to always contextualize it within the global art. So due to the amazing interest in the region's art, we always tend to focus on this area because of the lack of information currently, either in publications or on the internet, at least for the modern period, and therefore we're trying to make up for it. But the contemporary art of the region has boomed, as you're all aware of, and is treated equally like art from anywhere else. So introducing myself, I have been engaged with art from this region for several decades. I've curated exhibitions, among them the latest was the Palestinian collateral exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 2009. I've published books and catalogs on art of the region, and talking about the internet, it reminded me that in 1994 I uploaded the first information on Arab artists on the internet. And that was quite an experience. Doing that was so complicated. I collaborated with the University of Arizona to do that because I was not familiar with how to do it myself clearly, and they had a fantastic project to showcase art from international art on their web pages. So until recently, I was working at the Tourism and Culture Authority, helped establish the first professional development program for the training of staff who will be working in museums and heritage and other cultural projects at the TCA. And prior to that, some of you know me as was the executive director of the Art and Culture program at the Emirates Foundation. So I've been in the UAE for 5 wonderful years, experienced, as many of you have, the blooming of the art. And for me, having lived through years of practically no interest in Arab art at all, it's a very, very exciting time. So I've been asked through this series to sort of give the history of Arab art. It's very difficult and impossible to compress the history of Arab art in 3 sessions. So I usually try to introduce portraiture as it's been experienced by artists and audiences here in the region for not just the modern and contemporary period, but to go back to also ancient history, ancient art as well. And what we archaeologists have unearthed in treasures of art, whether in definitely not on canvas, but organic materials such as canvas and fabric doesn't last that long. But we clearly have evidence of art being practiced in this region from ancient times, as we know from the museum artifacts and other collections. So we looked at portraits through the ages, and then today we're going to look at landscape, maybe not as extensively because through the ages as I did last time with portraiture because of the time limitations, and I would like to focus more also on the contemporary period. So when we talk about landscape, what do we mean by that? Because it could be all kinds of types of landscapes. Landscape can be used as a term to describe the landscape or the environment we live in, or the landscape of nature's landscape, urban or countryside. But generally, people interact with their landscape, and they express that with from ancient times with decorations on the caves that where they express their relationship with nature, whether animals or plants or other, on the caves that exist in countries that's all over the region. Other early evidence of landscape we see mostly in mosaics that are found from the early Roman to the Greek and Byzantine era, and in particularly later on to the Umayyad, many of the Umayyad, during the Umayyad period. And talking about history and examples of all these kinds of artwork, I would recommend that you visit the timeline of art history of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where they have amassed examples of art from 20,000 BC to the present, or at least 2005. I worked for a year with them to record the history of the Western Asia, art of Western Asia from the year 1900 to 2004. And in these pages, we included not just the art, but the art practice and the environment that in which the art developed in the region. As you can see, there is a historical timeline. If you can just, there are 8 pages written on the subject, and once you enter any of these titles and search, you will find that there are key events. So you can actually focus, click on key events, and you will have a list of what occurred as it relates to art development from the year 1900 or slightly earlier to the almost mid-2000. And works of art are examples of artwork. Mostly, at that time, the Met was not collecting Arab art. They had a few artists such as Khalil Gibran and others, 2 others that were donated to their collection but never exhibited. And therefore, searching through their storage, it was not easy to locate any Arab artists. I did also cover Israeli art, so there is, as part of the region. Related content are hyperlinks to any of the topics I just mentioned earlier, such as Umayyad palaces you would find, or Byzantine mosaic, or influence of Byzantium on Islamic art. And all these are related topics that can be found on that website. Here is, for example, at the very top, it was deemed at that time that only images that are in the collection will be actually presented at the very top of the page. But if you go to examples or works of art, you will see that there are examples of around 55 or 60 artists from the region, from North Africa, Egypt, and the Arab world, the rest of the Arab world. So, with a short text on each. So if we talk about landscape, today we're going to talk about landscape in many different ways. Imagined landscape, realistic landscape, clearly, imagined landscapes, and idealized landscapes. And the landscape has been, there are many examples of Chinese and Japanese landscapes that you will also find on the Met and other museums and websites. And here is an example of one Madaba map, which was dated back to the 6th century AD in Madaba, Jordan. And this is a map that looks at the sort of a landscape of Jerusalem during that period. And we note the flatness of this piece. It's amazing that it stayed in such good condition till today. This is another very common landscapes that we have in many collections around the world. For example, for David Roberts and other travelers in the region who have either idealized or documented events such as this one, in historical event that took place in earlier ancient times, but documented as by David Roberts in this imagined, actually not documented, imagined story from the Bible. I want to just give you a couple more examples this is from the Umayyad period, and we're looking here at the Damascus Mosque in Damascus, Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and this is the treasury, and we can see here on the facade an ornate. Also, we can see the influence of the Byzantine style of art, as well as it's a landscape. So we can say that landscape is gone. That's in Damascus, Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. So we're going to jump now. As I said, much of this in between kind of landscape and art you could check back on with on the internet, because I want to focus on the modern and contemporary period. And if we look at these two periods, if I here grouped Egyptian and Iraqi landscape together because they were both, I believe, quite influenced or inspired by the ancient civilization in the region. And we can see they were pharaonic or Assyrian or other. And this is the one example by Mahmoud Saeed. I think many of you may have noted this work during the recent auction house. One of the auction houses sales, it I think was sold for over $500,000. Not this one, but one similar to this by Mahmoud Saeed from Egypt. Now note that in the period in the 30s and 40s and up to actually the 60s, many of the Egyptian artists admired the countryside and the fallahin, who they felt were the backbone of the nation. And much of the artwork was related to the identity of the and nationalism of the after the liberation from the British rule during the 20s. So we find that more and more as we move forward, we find more nationalist type of imagery in the landscape. And the woman generally represents the nation in Egyptian and Palestinian art as well. So if the fact that the laborers and the peasants are the backbone of the industry in Egypt and the economy is much represented in many of the artworks by Mahmoud Saeed and by Afet Nagy, by Mahmoud Nagy, and others. While we notice that in the artists from Alexandrian artists, where the landscape is more concerned with immediate social milieu of that time. So we'll find more portraiture that I gave example of last time. And another example here is by Muhammad al-Nahgi, who was both an ethnographer and a painter, and traveled a great deal in Upper Nile, Egypt, and had documented, we can say, the countryside and the landscape during that time, which is here in the 1930s. So these are, for the most part, oil on canvas. Moving forward in time, we see an example here of rituals or events that are also documented by artists such as Afet Nagy, who spent a great deal of her time in the countryside. That's where her family owned the Izba, or a large farm, and she detested the way that the laborers and the country folks were treated by the feudal system in Egypt. And she was quite an outspoken feminist and socialist, and was actually imprisoned for 2 years for her views by Jamal Abdel Nasser in the early 60s. So this is one of her works, A Funeral in Gurna Mountain in 1981. And as I said, this is an earlier work by Muhammad Nagy from the 1930s. But in between, we will find there are many other excellent examples of works by Egyptian artists that focus on the peasant, whether peasant woman or man. But in general, when the painting has a nationalist dimension, we will find that the woman is perceived as the mother of the nation, as in the sculpture of Mahmoud Mukhtar, for example, that you probably are familiar with. Moving on to Iraq, this is Nouri Rawi, and the work from actually very recent work, comparatively from the 1990s. But the reason I included this work is also to give an example of this idealized scene on the Tigris River, which clearly is not realistic of those times, but it is in the vein of the Impressionist period that we will see more examples of later. This is another one by Khader Jader from also Iraq. Landscape, but this is more an urban landscape compared to this more like the traditional homes in the countryside. But again, it is an idealized sort of serialist almost type of landscape, which is typical in some of his work. Barshil collection here in Sharjah has an excellent examples from this period, from the 1940s to the 60s, which make a very good examples on landscape as well as portraiture. Abdel Hadi al-Ghazar, while this particular painting is focused more on the foreground, in the background we can see the landscape that's Egypt and the Nile. And moving forward quickly, the period that I actually skipped a little bit would have been in Egypt, what we call the pharaonic mania period during the discovery of the Tut exhibition, and during the discovery of Tutankhamun in the 1920s. That particular period was, the artist was influenced definitely by the pharaonic, and in that relationship to the artist was that they going back to their roots, to the Egyptian roots rather than the Arab roots. So here we're talking about the nation in particularly represented by the pharaonic style of art, which you can see actually up to the day in Hassan Hafez and other artists from Egypt who still work with this domain are inspired by the pharaonic art. Not only artists but also writers during that period, like Tawfiq al-Hakim or Ahmed Shawqi or even Taha Hussein has been wrote and popularized the ancient past in their poetry. In North Africa, there are examples such as this one of the art, and this is the art in Tunisia. I don't have too many examples from this modern period for North African, like Maghrebi artists from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. This is one of the few that I have found from the 1920s. I'm sure there are others that I actually, if you go back to the Metropolitan Museum website, you will find a couple more examples as well. This is Yahya Turki, and this painting was dates back to the 1920s. And the experience of painters in North Africa differs between each country. So we can't just say that painters from the Maghreb Al-Arabi are all experience or portray landscape in the same manner. It really depends on the country and the experience and how the impact of the French colonial rule on the training of the artists in those regions. For example, there were many exhibitions by European artists in Algeria in the 19th century and the 20th century. But very little attention was paid to the artwork of the local Algerians until the 1960s and the liberation of Algeria. In 1930s, the Museum of Algeria was established to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the occupation of Algeria by the French. Well, if we look in Morocco, it's sort of a similar case. I mean, it was individual artists who traveled to study in France, but we don't see too many artists who, in that period, now we're talking up to the 1960s, who were encouraged or offered scholarship to study abroad, as is the case, for example, with the Iraqi artists who had an advantage of and the Egyptians early in the century, 19th century, of having opportunities to study abroad with government scholarships. If we look at Tunisia, it's sort of, well, many European artists had exhibition and traveled to Tunisia, as you well know, including Matisse and Paul Klee, and that actually influenced and impacted the work of some of the early artists there. But again, we don't find, I had worked or seen work of artists in Morocco that interact with nature and where they're living in the deserts or in the Atlas Mountains and using natural material in their artwork to create landscape art. But unfortunately, I don't have examples of them here. So this is, we're moving here back to Syria, and this is again a romanticized, idealized sort of landscape of Dummar. Unfortunately, this doesn't exist anymore. Probably it's this water you wouldn't, has been tainted with a lot of blood now with recent atrocities happening in Syria. George Sabag, this is in Lebanese artist, and we can see the work here verges on the Impressionist style. As we move forward and see another work by Sha'ban Zaki, again from Egyptian Delta, and the Nile are quite common subjects in the works of artists from Lebanon and Syria, who traveled to Egypt, and some remained in Egypt and worked there, including art writers and as well as artists during that period. Tawfiq Tari is from Syria, and this is a countryside scene again. You can see that generally the landscape as we know it, you will see includes the horizon and the in relationship to the land. And so this is, if we look at these works and paintings, it's very common now. Some of the artists have a different landscape or color tone that they use. But generally the water is prominent in the paintings of much of the landscape that I have, as you notice from these. So it's not just a coincidence that I chose this, but it seems that if we look at it generally, landscape does include a water factor, unless, of course, it's a desert landscape. Okay, Mustafa Farroukh is well-known artist from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He was very active and has many, many paintings of landscapes of Lebanon, and especially the mountain and a few of the city. So this is an excellent example of his work during that period. And if we compare it with a Palestinian artist, this is actually watercolor by Sophie Halabi, who passed away, I think, in the early 90s in Jerusalem. She always used solely watercolor in her painting and drew their immediate surroundings. So this would be possibly looking out from her window, but I'm not exactly sure from a distance from Jerusalem, but not sure exactly where. She also traveled, but not, and always carried with her her sketchbook and her watercolors. But for the most part, most of her collection is now in Jerusalem and needs conservation, a great deal of conservation. But she's one of the most prolific Palestinian artists who are not very well known here in the art auction houses and galleries yet. Again, there is the water here, so I think this might be imagined because Jerusalem is landlocked. I mean, unless you go to the Dead Sea, and this doesn't look like a view from the Dead Sea. So I'm assuming that this is her imagined view of Tiberias. Another Lebanese artist is Omar Unsi. I'm sorry of the way the lens shine. I took this from somebody, a collector in Beirut. I don't have they didn't have a better image of it, but I wanted to also show the style of landscape very early on, and this one is in from the 50s. So I believe that the Lebanese are more known among the Arabs for landscape than any of their. If we look at the number of landscape produced by Arab artists, we note that during this period from the 30s to the 60s, the Lebanese were very much engaged in this style. Now, so why people, as I said earlier, actually paint landscape? They can either, as I said, document events such as the religious procession that Inji Aflatun documented in her painting, or document a moment in time as an experience they've had. Landscape is part of the memory. In recent time, too many refugees in the Arab world, for the landscape of their city or the village or the countryside is the last image that they see, whether from the window of a plane or the car, or as they are being forced on foot to flee from the atrocities taking place. So you can imagine the glance that those people have taken, or looking back and seeing the destruction and the landscape of Syria now or in Iraq. So many people, many of these refugees are traveling or are moving with the last, image of their country, and it is a landscape that they have seen, most probably, and to them this is what they would remain with them and with their children in the future. So we might, in the future, see young emerging artists who will be painting their impressions of these scenes from Baghdad or from Syria or Iraq or Syria. But for the Lebanese, for example, in the 30s, and all actually Lebanese who worked on the landscape, we don't see them documenting, for example, major atrocities or events that took place under the Ottoman rule. During that period, as I mentioned in my last lecture, there were many prominent artists like Dawood Kurm and others who were engaged in portrait painting. And then came the artists who painted in the style of the Impressionist. And after that, in the late 40s, we see work by, for example, Salwa Mikdadi, who's one of the earliest abstract artists in Lebanon, and followed by Shafiq Aboud and Saliba Dwehi and others whose landscape started changing. So if we see from this example here, Shafiq Aboud's work from the 1920s compared to the one on the left from the 1970s, both are landscape. So the one on the right is the landscape of a village in the mountains of Lebanon, and on the left we see the mountains overlooking the Mediterranean, a beautiful work of art. المتحف has several, in Doha, Qatar, has several works by Saliba Dwehi from this period of abstraction. And it's very interesting to compare the color, the use of color in both, and between the mountains, how the range of mountain, Mount Sanin and other mountains. I'm not sure what view he has from this angle, but in Lebanon, the mountains and the ranges around them are significant in the work of artists. Now, artists such as Huguette Caland, this is one of the pieces actually that were in Art Abu Dhabi recently by, I'm not sure which gallery now at this point. It's titled City 2, and as you see, it was painted in 1968. Huguette Caland had several works actually that she portrayed the city landscape. To her, this is an abstraction of the city landscape she lived in. These are typical of her colors she used during that period. Although she was not engaged in landscape, her work is more about her personal experience, her body. Her body was her landscape in a way, because she responded to her, the human body and her own body in much of the works, and that I know if some of you have seen her work in the latest Art Dubai exhibition on modern art. There were exquisite works in that exhibit last year, and I hope next year we'll have at Art Dubai another section on modern art period, because there is a wealth of art. I'm going to pass this one. I think it's here by, it's not exactly a landscape, while it is sort of hints at the archaeological landscape by Arif al-Rayes. But I wanted to go back to this piece. This work is by an Algerian artist. His name is Mohamed Rassim, and his landscape was Algeria, but it was more he documented life, daily life in Algeria, as well as actually historical events in the past history of Algiers, but not during the revolution, which is very interesting. And this work, for example, was done after the independence of, I believe, after the independence of Algiers. And you see this is a typical scene of women visiting or having coffee on the roof. And as if some of you have visited the capital, Algiers, you know, the Kasbah region, you could actually jump from one roof to the other. And that's how your neighbors communicated. So so this work as clearly is in the style of Islamic miniature painting, and there are very few artists in the Arab world has used this style compared to Persian or South Asian artists, particularly contemporary artists. But we see this is that Mohamed Rassim has done this in a large number of work, and his work is found at the Museum of Modern Art in Algiers. Not the new one, the older one that was established in 1930s up on the hill. Here is another work of art. I think this is in the Barjil collection by Raghib Ayad from the 60s as well. I tried to group the 60s together to give you an idea what people were thinking of, what were they documenting, what were the important events during that period. Clearly the building of the Aswan Dam and the changes in the landscape of the Nubian area, the Nubian plateau actually, or region there, was significant because all the Nubians were displaced and their land was flooded with water to create the Lake Nasser. And here we see the workers building the dam. What happened during that period is that the government commissioned artists in Cairo to spend time documenting the workers and the building of the dam, and Raghib Ayad was one of them. Another typical landscape from Egypt we see includes the pyramids clearly, and this one is by Gazibiya Sirri, I think, from the 1960s. Gazibiya portrays herself here within that landscape, and her work slowly transformed, and by the 70s she was working more in an expressionist, abstract expressionist style, especially 70s and 80s. While artists in the same period or a bit later, like Hafiz Drubi, was still working in the Cubist style. This is a very famous work of art that was looted from the Iraqi museum, and today it's not sure what happened to that work. It's one of the works that I actually featured on the Metropolitan website in order to ensure that it is not resold and that it will be returned to its home in the museum in Iraq. I believe this is clear enough. Yes. So this is one of the few Cubist-style landscapes that I could find from Iraq or from this period. Fatih al-Mudarris, many of you are maybe familiar with his work. Typically, he has these turbaned or women wearing these scarves in a different typical way. And but for this landscape comes from the 1960s, and it does not feature any. It's not people. You know, there's a faint figure in the distance, but it is different, very different from his later work where the figures are in the foreground. He is inspired clearly by the region where he grew up in north of Damascus, in the northern Syria, the countryside. So most of his work has been actually based on that and his family that was still living in that area. So these are two examples of these works from that period. Muhammad al-Qaisi is 1980 artist, Lebanese artist, and I don't think he is that well known yet. Eventually he'd come up on the market maybe. Here we see the Lebanese hills and the typical villages with red tiled roofs you notice in the other Lebanese landscape also. Most of these homes clearly are stone houses. So he generally painted in the Impressionist style, but and I want to move forward here and talk about what artists were doing. If this work was in the 1980s in Lebanon, note what was happening here in the Emirates in the 1980s. What's interesting is that the way the artists in the UAE, at least two artists, Hassan Sharif and Muhammad Kazem, were interacting with their environment in a very different way than the painters of Lebanon. So generally, for those who are not familiar of art of the region, assume that Lebanese art was by far more advanced than the art from the Gulf states. But we do have exceptions in the fact that Hassan Sharif, early on in the 80s, before he went to England to study, was actually used to go out in the desert and interact with that and record his interaction, whether running in the desert or walking or interacting in his own landscape, immediate urban landscape. So these are very interesting and important works. There is a whole series of them, such as these. And you can find more on the website of the gallery that represents him, or in his own website. I think this is a very important historical timeline for for performance art in the region. And note that there is a camera, someone is carrying a camera, and his actions in the desert and his performance is being recorded step by step, like as if still image by still image. And he definitely influenced many other artists, including Muhammad Kazem, as in this one. Now, Muhammad Kazem work called Autobiography in 1997. It is an autobiography of a city, actually, in transformation, which is Dubai, and he implicates himself within this scene by taking a series of photographs in different areas of Dubai and then repeating that over and over. So he also was influenced by Hassan Sharif in his work. So you can see that here. Now, this is clearly from the 1997. In 1998, in 1987, I have so far recorded that the first Lebanese performing art project took place on the Green Line, by the Lebanese artist Rabia Sukkarieh, where she created an installation on the Green Line during this was before the end of the Civil War, a few years before, and therefore she actually took a big chance by creating that installation, and it was recorded on video by the television in Beirut. So that was, as far as I know, the first installation performance art that took place in Lebanon. There might be others, but we're trying to find out which ones were they and if they actually did take place in Lebanon. Or if in other performing arts or video or installation arts, when did it actually start? This is becoming more and more important to find out, because there are artists who these kinds of events were not recorded during the Civil War, and we are now trying to find records of them. So another artist in the UAE who was influenced by Hassan Sharif, I believe, and she was and Muhammad Kazim is Ibtisam Abdelaziz, many of you may be familiar with. She's represented by the Third Line Gallery, not far from here. And here she is actually why would we call this landscape? But this is her urban landscape. And we note that if we look back at all the images that we saw prior to these, we noticed that the interaction or the landscape was with the more of a countryside landscape or a very romantic type landscape, where it separated the painter from the environment. I mean, he's recording a certain period of time or idealizing it. But with the contemporary artists, they are interacting with this landscape here, as Ibtisam does, wearing this outfit with the actually drawing attention to the workers' plight in the Gulf. So this is quite an interesting and maybe one of the first to draw attention to this in the region.
What she did in that performance?
This is debris from construction, and what she did, she drew attention to, if you walk around or you pass workers here, they're resting in any one spot. There are not certain areas where they can rest. So they'll be working, and all of a sudden you see a worker just stretched out on the grass, between either on the median or on the pavement. So that is something is becoming a very common sight here in the UAE, and so I think she's trying to draw attention to that, and that might be it, if I remember correctly, or at least this is how I interpret it. Another artist from who has been engaged with the landscape for some time, since actually she started drawing Mount Tamalpais, which is in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, or in Marin County, and from her studio or apartment in Sausalito in Northern California. And then when she was in Beirut, she did similar painting. This is a more recent work from 2005. But the reason I included this and this work from 2013 is to draw attention to her actually accordion-style artist books. And these are books that she started drawing on from the early 1960s. Tel Adnan lives and works between Beirut and Paris. This piece is more recent work that she has done, but this is how she started actually painting and drawing. She is a poet, an essayist, and well-known internationally and in the region now, after being represented in Documenta, in the last one, Documenta, a couple of years ago. And generally, these accordion-style books can go up to 20 feet in length, 15 to 20 feet. They're very long. And Etel grew up in studying in private schools, and her primary language was Arabic, but she did not know how to read and write Arabic because she was in parochial schools, French school, where she learned French and English. So she writes in French or in English. And in order to compensate for that, I believe, she has created these kinds of books where she copies the written poem in Arabic, copies it as if painting it. So she paints the poetry on these without knowing what they actually mean unless they're translated or read out to her. So they're read out, but the actual script is a hand script. So it's not calligraphy in that sense. And it's interacting in a very unique way with the poem, which she can listen to, but she cannot read. This is a very unique situation. And in this book here, I don't think the writing is there. This is actually an interesting one because it relates to this installation, which is on alabaster and black resin with alabaster, which is actually possibly accompanies this accordion style book. Both of these came from the art fair, Abu Dhabi Art Fair. They were recently exhibited there. This is work by a Bahraini artist, Balqis Fakhro, in response to the first Gulf War in the early 90s. And this is what she saw out of her window. The landscape was, she's here referring to the oil fields on fire that she saw from Bahrain, or in Kuwait, and she saw from Bahrain. So landscapes can come in many different ways. Fuad al-Khouri, a fictional landscape, such as this one, Sweet Egyptian, is a sort of a fictional landscape that looks like more sci-fi or a documentary. This is a work that was commissioned by the Institut du Monde Arabe in 1987, I think, to portray Amman. During the fall of that year, Khouri documented different areas in Jabal Amman and the different districts of Amman. The idea behind this work was to show the topography of Amman while concentrating on a scenic view at the same time. At that time, it was not as built up as it is now, clearly. I think this area now is totally filled with new homes on both sides. Here's another work, Traces of War, 1944 to 97, Apocalypse, Beirut. And Fuad Khouri is represented here also by Third Line Gallery and had several exhibitions, I think one coming up soon. This is also manipulation of the photography so that it does look like a fictional scene from the pyramids. And it's interesting to see his more recent work from 2005 compared to, this is Sharjah and this is Cairo, or here is Beirut and Amman. And these landscapes definitely differ from this kind of style landscape that is in presentation in color. Another popular artist here in the region is Tariq Al-Ghussein, who's a professor of photography at NYU Abu Dhabi, and we're all familiar with his iconic paintings where photographs where he's always part of the photograph and part of the nature or the scene. And generally it's a landscape of either in being developed, in nature being an intervention in nature. So it seems that he's a protagonist, but he is actually also the observer or the person who's documenting this change in nature that's taking place, whether it's Adiyat Island or on the or other areas in Sharjah that he has documented over the years. This is a still from a video called Of Time and Light by Soha Shuman, where she also actually portrays herself within that landscape, interacting with it, and creating a landscape within a landscape in Darat al-Funun, as you can see. That mostly, she is a painter as well, and she has painted landscape of Petra, beautiful landscapes of the rock and in Jordan. I'm gonna go over this one. Another, as you see, I have several examples from the Emirates, because it's interesting to see how many of the artists in the Emirates have interacted with the nature around them. Desert or mountain. And this is one work that you may have seen at the Emirati Expression last year by Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim, who always faced from his window this mountain or in Khurfakan. And it just disturbed him that he could not see beyond that. So he actually manipulated a photograph where he created a hole in the mountain. So it's very interesting. An idealized, I talked about idealized landscapes. This one is an idealized or in the memory of Palestinians, such as this is one Sliman Mansour from the 1980s, and typical on the landscape of the Palestine and now the West Bank is these olive groves, which have been at time many of these olive groves have been actually cut, butchered by the Israelis. So this is his impression of what happened to the olive groves and under occupation, and this is the idealized scene 20 years earlier. And the same scene is in the photography of Raed Bawardi, and this is what's happening now to the orchards, is that the Israelis threaten either burn or cut these orchards or don't allow the Palestinians to harvest the olives during the harvest season. So many of the owners of these orchards sleep on the land to make sure that they'll be able to harvest what they can to avoid harassment by the Israelis. So the documentation, this is a landscape that's being documented as well by the artist. This is, again, we go back to the fictional landscape, and this is a project by Joanna Haji Thomas and Khalil Jreish, and we see here a fictional photographer, Abdallah Farah, who between 1968 and 69 was commissioned by the Lebanese state to take pictures to be edited on postcards, such as this one. And in these pictures, we look at central Beirut district, and which at that time in the 60s was known as the Riviera of the Arab world. And what they have done is they actually took the negatives and they manipulated the negatives, and there are several of these postcards look at the destruction of Beirut, as you can see. When many of the negatives, they implanted all the bombs taking in different areas. So Beirut turned from an idealized Lebanese Riviera to a site of destruction. But this is, again, is an imagined reality. So moving very quickly to the present, actually this is a work done in 2009 by Driss Kouadi, and he is an Algerian artist represented, I think, by Lori Shabibi. This work is on exhibit either now or was at the Art Abu Dhabi Fair. And what's interesting about this is almost like photorealism. It's all oil on canvas work of, this is another, it's the building, it's the city, and we can see more and more the young artists are engaged with their city. They're living all in urban settings, and they are not as engaged in the countryside or what happens beyond that. So I brought in a few examples of from his work to it's exquisitely produced, I think. And of course, there are also the imaginary that almost verges on the very science fiction type of work, almost modern surrealism in a way by Jafar Khaldi. It's a mix. This is all oil on canvas as well. But how do some of the artists interact with the landscape in order to protect the landscape, actually? Here is a work by Saba Annab, who's an architect and architect from Jordan, and she created this installation in Shatana, which is a village about an hour's drive from Amman, where there are large quarries where the stone, where much of the buildings are stone buildings in Amman, and that's where the quarries are, a large number of them around that town. And what happened is that the dust that results out of the cutting of these stone pollutes not just the air, but you can see the nature is all covered with these fine particles of dust from the stone quarries. And she wanted to create awareness about on the this environmental disaster, which led to the health problems. And as a result, most of the inhabitants of the town left, migrated to the city, leaving only the older generation, around 100 people living. So they had sort of like an artist residency in this town, and this was the project that she did. This is an image of the quarry from far. This is a closer image, and you can see how much of the mountain is cut to produce these stones. And this is a detail of the brush, and you can see the film of dust that's deposited on the leaves, on the branches. And you can imagine what happens to the lungs of the people living in that area. I included this work to show that the artists also use the landscape as a form of activism in order to draw attention to these problems in the environment. This is a work that received an Abraj Award in 2011. It's a landscape that we see high from, we don't see ourselves maybe, but possibly others, defense, or you can note this landscape from the title of this work is Shadow Side 2, and it has the markings of man-made activities on a landscape. So this is an aerial view, and by Joanne Al-Ani. The title of the work is Shadow Side 2 from 2011. So it is clear that here she references the Desert Storm campaign during the invasion of Iraq, and the landscape that has been utilized for that purpose, and the markings that are left after the war. And this is what we're left with. So the evidence plus the... So it's a different type of landscape than the romantic landscape that we saw in earlier images. Another very different landscape is by Bassem Magdi, who's an Egyptian artist living in Switzerland, I believe. And this image is a single slide projected sequence from a projected sequence of different slides that he took. And then what he did, he manipulated them. Although these slides are already seem unreal, but they're of a volcano in the Canary Islands, called or on the island of Lanzarote. And the work proposes that the phantom imagery records the future memory in these kind of almost unreal images. Yet what he did is he dipped these images in chemicals, referring by this action, referring to a method of processing film that is now long gone. And as a result, you see the haze and the different impressions on the film. I want to just give an example of another type of work which is on paper. So that differs. We saw film, we saw video, we stills, we saw photography, oil on canvas, traditional landscapes. And now we look at a different landscape, which is with ink and watercolor by Hiba Kalash. This is called the Ascent. I mean, sort of apocalyptic type of subject. We can see that there are several who have hinted on that in their work. She lives and works in Beirut. And her work was exhibited once, I think, in Art Dubai, I believe. So it's a beautiful work. I don't know how it, yes, you can see it clearly here. And you can see as if people going through a procession here at their final hour.
How large is this piece?
How large?
Yeah.
This could be she works with generally large pieces, but this one I would then say maybe 1.5 by 1 meter. And she has others that are slightly maybe smaller, but now she's working on a very large, almost mural size piece that looks at all the barricades in Beirut. And she mapped out the barricades in Beirut through some research she's done and created walls almost similar to the Israeli apartheid wall. And and if you look at the works, you can see all these partition, and you can also see a fractured city, as Joanna, Haji Thomas, and Khalil Jreish mentioned in their work. So you can see this kind of relationship between the artists, and not sure who influenced who, but this is the reality of Beirut and what's happening there. So she's having an exhibit at Beirut Art Center. This work will be exhibited there, I think, next week, possibly. This is a work that was exhibited in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi, actually recently, by a Moroccan artist. No, I'm sorry. A Tunisian, I think, artist. I'm sorry, I'm Algerian, that's right. But yeah, Faisal Bakdash, Algerian artist. And well, you already know about it then. Most of you have seen it maybe. I find it very interesting. I think this is the site of where they were filming Star Wars in Tunisia, and many artists, more than one artist, have taken shots of that site. But I thought I would include it because it attracted several artists to this type of a landscape, which is Star Wars landscape type. This is another type of desert landscape that I spotted in Art Abu Dhabi. I wasn't familiar with this work earlier, and I thought it was an interesting piece. And just to show you how the art market works, these are works not by an Arab artist, by a Turkish artist actually. And last year in Art Dubai or Abu Dhabi, she had presented the work Aleppo, which was very popular with, and I guess it had an emotional, people were quite emotional to see the city. During that time, the Aleppo was under siege, and they started probably bombarding the city, and many casualties as a result of that. So that piece sold for a large sum, I think, over $100,000 for sure dollars at that time, and was immediately bought. For this year, she did another work, which is down there, and on Beirut. I thought it was interesting how artists tend to respond to the market so quickly. This is the image that I meant to show you earlier by Hassan Sharif in 1983. It's called Jumping in the Desert. I found this very interesting work for the 80s, with other performance. For Muhammad Kazim, these are also works that are not very recent, but they're interesting because they also look at his immediate urban landscape. Because when he looks outside his window, this is what he sees, his neighbors wash on the line. And he's taken a whole series of this, but takes only the tip, the top part of the picture. And the rest, as you can see, is the horizon. It's a beautiful installation of several works. So it's a series. And how he interacts with his environment immediately, and such as in this work, which was exhibited at the Venice Biennale. And I'm going to skip that because I really want to come to an artist, which I was quite impressed by his work when I came to the UAE and got introduced to his journeys. At that time, he had just come back from Brazil, where he traveled on foot many, many miles, recording his journey actually in a journal, as well as sketching his journey in Brazil. Then he came back here, and after spending, I think, 3 months in Brazil, and continued other journeys that he took around where he lives in the Northern Emirates. And this is a work that is titled Kamar Kande, his journey, and it was inspired by his journey in Brazil and the parallel journey that he did here. This is a journey. Generally, the journeys create an he sort of create a situation where the companionship is important to him in the journey. So it doesn't have to be a friend. Generally, it's an animal, or even taking with him a familiar object on this journey. He states in the interviews that this is part of part of his process, part of his thinking process, and his relationship to the land is through these companions. So on this journey, he took a donkey along, and on this one, he took objects along that journey. And this is a watermelon series. Actually, it was exhibited in Sharjah last year. Beautiful series, and it's clear why he is called watermelon. Also, in the spirit of journeys, he did these thongs or slippers that generally you see worn here in summery climates. But instead of being light and easy to wear, they're, of course, grounded by weight. Other artists that work in traditional landscapes is Abdul Qadir Reyes. And this is from a totally different type of video installation, still from work by Raida Saadeh, Palestinian who grew up in Jerusalem. And it's clear here that she's trying to erase the occupation. So she uses her artwork and by trying to erase or vacuum out the occupation on the landscape near Jerusalem. And here she is actually interacting with the landscape on their occupation, mostly the wall, the apartheid wall that imprisons the Palestinian, and is due to the apartheid wall that so many Palestinians lost their property. This other landscape here is Gates of Hell by Rula Halawani, a photographer. And again, going back to the Emiratis, I just wanted to note how many Emiratis do work with landscape in the region. This is Sheikha Latifa bint Maktoum, and this is the last one. Thank you very much.